right, so thank you all for coming to my last speech for this communications class. I appreciate your willingness to participate and be my audience. We're inside today, which is nice. It's a little bit of a different setup. Hopefully everybody can see. I know I'm blocking the board right now, but I'll move once we get into that. We have a visual this time, which is nice. So feel free to move forward if you need to see things, and we'll get started. So today we're going to talk about recognizing your horse's natural asymmetries and what you can do to improve upon that. You know, we're all riders. We all want to make sure our horses are comfortable and happy in their work. So I hope that you get some good information from this. I'm going to start with a kind of a controversial and maybe unpleasant comment, but I do believe it's true. Horses were not designed to carry people. You know, they're prey animals. They don't have that strong back. They generally have kind of a long, weakish back. They have long, spindly legs, and they carry a lot of their weight on their front end, really kind of where the rider sits. So they weren't designed to carry people around, but our ancestors, you know, however long ago, saw these animals that were fast and agile and could outrun predators, and they knew they wanted that speed that humans just don't have, so they domesticated horses, and we've been using them, you know, ever since, and that's, you know, kind of how the partnership started. So they still weren't designed to carry us, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't and that they can't, as we've seen. So, you know, I've been engaged in, as you know, some of you know, I've been engaged in the study of biomechanics. I've taken lessons with Jillian Kreinbring and Marika de Jong and locally Meg Brausch, all who have great knowledge, both modern and historical, on some of these imbalances that have been discovered on horses and how to improve them to make their work with us comfortable and to make them comfortable in their own bodies, even if you don't ride. If you have a horse that has an injury or really some kind of, you know, major conformational defect that makes certain things uncomfortable, by helping to rebalance their bodies, you can make them more comfortable just existing. So I think we all want that for our animals. So this isn't a new concept. As I mentioned, you know, the people that I've studied with have a great deal of historical knowledge. You know, the old European masters, some of the vaqueros in the, you know, the South American horse people, they all recognize that horses need to be agile, they need to be strong, and they need to be able to carry themselves without the support of the rider. And they did this during a time where horses were used not just to, you know, hack out on trails or maybe go to local competitions, but these horses were going to battle. And it was literally life or death for both the rider and the animal. And they spent a great deal of time and money investing in these animals, and they wanted to make them as strong and as agile and as safe as possible. And that's where these concepts of, you know, high school education of horses came from. And we see a lot of these works where the animal is able to rock back on its hindquarters and turn quickly, and, you know, they're very quick and agile, and that is not something that just happened overnight. These old school masters knew how to train the body and how to observe the body to see where maybe a horse was not balanced, you know, left to right or front to back, and how to improve on that with education of the body. We're not going to get into that level of detail, but this is really just a kind of dip your toe in to understand that these things exist and that you really can change them. So by observing and feeling under saddle the horse's natural asymmetry, you can start to develop an idea and that's the first step, is to understand, wow, when I ask for, a left lead canter, well, they don't always get the left lead canter. Sometimes they pick up the right lead. Sometimes they, left lead canter in the front, but they're right lead behind, or something's wrong. But on the right, everything's great. Picks up the right lead canter all the time. Well, that is probably because of an imbalance between the hind legs. The right hind leg could be pushing more than the left hind leg, or vice versa. The left hind leg could be pushing more, which makes the right lead canter easier to achieve. So things like that. Instead of thinking, oh, my horse is just bad, he doesn't understand. Well, he might not understand. He's probably not bad. It's probably, there's probably a physical limitation. Maybe it's arthritis. Maybe it's an old injury. But maybe it's just an imbalance that you can improve upon. So, as I mentioned before, horses have several asymmetries, front to back, side to side. And actually, a fairly recent study within the last few years, out of Sweden, they have determined that horses are more asymmetrical than they are symmetrical. They found more asymmetries in movements than they did actual symmetries, which is just incredible. So, we don't necessarily notice these things. I mean, you don't go out and say, oh my goodness, every single horse out there is moving kind of wonky. But these are researchers who are looking at very specific things. So knowing that there's more out of balance and imbalance should really make you sit back and think, well, how can I improve on that, or at least not add to it as a rider? Oops, I'm out of order here. So, today we're going to focus on the front to back asymmetry, but I'll touch a little bit on left to right as we go through. So front to back asymmetry, what do I mean by that? So we are, if you think about your horse, we've all seen a horse, they carry the bulk of their weight on their front end. So you've got, from our pictures here, I'll step out of the way, and sorry if they're small on the video, but, we can see that in this area, the front end, we've got the head, the neck, the muscular chest, all of the organs, the ribs, everything, the front part of the ribs, the shoulders, the lungs start up here. All of that weight is on the front end. If we look back here on the hindquarters, there's very little there. Sure, there's bones, there's pelvis, there's some internal organs, but there's a quite obvious distinct imbalance there. That's our main and first imbalance that we're going to talk about. So what does that mean? Horses, they're grazing animals. Their heads are down. It makes sense that they put a lot of weight on their front end. That's totally fine for a grazing animal. But when you add the weight of the rider here behind the neck in the withers area, you're adding more weight to that front end. The horse's center of balance is about here, about where the rider sits. So we as riders are also adding to that imbalance. So what do we do to change that? So by looking at these quick drawings, we see these red dots. And what are those dots? That is the line of balance. So if we're talking about, being level and being even in our, the way the body balances, vertically, we can see this horse is higher on the front end than on the hindquarters. This horse, it's about level. And this horse is quite a bit more down on the front end. So what does that mean? That means conformationally, structurally, this horse is going to have a harder time putting more weight on the hindquarters and rebalancing that asymmetry. So, doesn't mean you can't ride that horse. It doesn't mean much of anything in the beginning, but it is an awareness. This horse is probably going to be able to lower the hind end, take some of the weight off of the front end by lowering that hind end, and make the front end higher, making its work a little bit easier depending on the work. You know, if you're somebody that does that has a cutting horse, you want the horse probably to be more like this, because they get low and they get down so that they can get in front of those cows. This horse probably wouldn't be so successful. So you want to think about those things, form and function, when you're thinking about asymmetry and the job that you're going to ask your animal to do. So we've just made a quick observation. You can all do that at home. That's the first step, observing your animal. The next thing is to feel them. If you ride, you can get on your horse, and at the walk, a lot of good instructors will do this. They'll tell you, to close your eyes, or perhaps, they'll have you on a lead and they'll say, tell me when the inside hind leg is raising. That means that your hip goes up when their back leg lifts off the ground. So you know that if your one hip is up longer than the other, well, maybe one hind leg pushes more than the other. Just another observation. What you do with it is a little bit more complicated, but it's something to be aware of. And that's all we're really talking about today, is an awareness of these asymmetries. So that right there, the next time you ride, just take a few minutes in your warm-up at the walk and feel, does your horse push out a shoulder? Is the head turned a little bit more when you're not asking him to, and you're, just going on a straight line and not interfering with them at all? That's how the horse normally travels. So now there's, a little bit of an asymmetry, whether it's structural, meaning their conformation, or maybe it's just, they have a tight muscle, or they were trained that way before you got them. Who knows? So once you've identified these areas, the main thing, because we're talking about front to back asymmetries, is to think about engaging the hindquarters and having the horse lower the hindquarters to lighten up this front end. Because you as a rider here, you are adding to this. So if they can engage enough to free up the front end, your weight is not as much of a burden, if that makes sense. Some people think, we've been riding horses forever. Horses are in competition. They're in the Olympics. We're not talking about race horses. That's totally different topic, totally different biomechanics. But riding horses, we've been doing this forever. Why does any of this matter? You talked about the old school masters, and, we don't ride like that anymore. And that's true. But that doesn't mean that we can't improve on what we have. And those old school masters and the vaqueros, they knew what they were doing, and those horses were incredible athletes. And we all kind of want that. It doesn't matter if you are, going out on a trail ride or going to a horse show or whatever. You want your horse to be performing at its peak for their ability. And that's what those teachers knew back then. And we lost that when horses, fortunately, were no longer part of a cavalry. I mean, we don't use them for war anymore, thank goodness. So we lost that education because there wasn't a life or death situation going on. So that's, that was a big loss for us, but we do have people that are coming back and bringing that information back to the forefront. If you do a Google search of biomechanics, you can find millions of articles looking back at the old masters, La Grenier, Podolsky from the Spanish riding school. You can also find the new masters and the new researchers. I mean, that's something that wasn't there historically. The Swedish researchers and other technologies that can measure some of these things. There was a study done to determine the best head and neck position to balance this whole front end. The head and neck position. We're not talking about being on the bit. We're talking about the fulcrum that is the neck, and what is the best position to manage some of the asymmetries. I mean, that's huge. You don't think about that. So we're really lucky that we have this wealth of knowledge now that, we had the training back then, hundreds of years ago. Now the training's coming back and the knowledge is there. So it's really a great time if you take an interest in this sort of thing. Some people say, well, we no longer keep animals in draft work. So why do we need them to be so strong and so capable of working all day? And we don't need them to be capable of working all day, but we need to make them as comfortable as possible in their work. They are our companions. They are our therapy for, some of us who just need to blow off some steam, but they also provide therapy for people who are injured, who have other types of disabilities. We want to make sure that we are not taking advantage of these animals and that we are able to help them work in their bodies in the best way possible. And most, if not all riders, all of us have some kind of goal. It may not be to ride in the Olympics, but there is a goal. Whenever we set out to do something, we have a goal that we want to achieve, a flying lead change, or just having a collected and more balanced ride. These are simple goals that we can help to achieve just by thinking about how the horse's body is structured and how we can improve on that. Making observations and developing small changes is really an effective way to make sure that you're doing the best for your animal. Observations are easy. We all of us have our horses at home, so we can all see, out in the pasture. If I look out the windows back there, I can see, how my horse is standing. Are they standing? They're all going to be head down grazing on their front end, but do they have one back leg that's always in front of the other, one front leg always out? Looking at these things, it may seem simple and remedial, but it really does tell you a story, and that's information that you can then use in your training. No rider wants to do harm, of course, or burden their horse. So, we do everything we can. We all care about our animals. They're part of our family. So we want to make sure that in addition to providing the best quality care, we're also thinking about the best care for their bodies. Sure, veterinary medicine has come a long way. There are injections into joints to make them more comfortable. There are NSAIDs that can keep animals comfortable for longer periods of time. There's chiropractics and massage and all kinds of modalities that really help to improve how the horse feels. But as riders and trainers, we have the obligation, I think, to make sure that we're also doing things to help them really work in a better form for their bodies. So, at the end of the day, now that we're kind of wrapping this up, you can no longer say you're not aware of the asymmetries. It's easy to observe. We know that horses are, carry more weight on their front end. It's not something that you can't ignore. It's just a known fact. Now, the question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? Are you going to continue to think about, well, am I burdening my horse by not asking it to carry itself and not teaching it how to carry itself in a more efficient manner? Or are you just going to go along the way you always have and hope for the best. I think I know which way most of you are going to go. So thank you.